All right. Well, hi. Just wanted to welcome everyone to this seminar, and yeah, really excited to have a great guest with us today. And so, yeah, at the Institute of Environment here at UC Davis, we're really interested in natural climate solutions and figuring out ways that also to meet the grand challenge of how do we feed the world and increase food production without making too much of a mess while keeping the ecosystems healthy, keeping our life support systems working. And our guest today, Lisa Schulte Moore, is really working at the heart of both of those things. She's a professor in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management at Iowa State University, which, like UC Davis, has a really big links to the agricultural industry and figuring out ways to do things better there. She's the co-director of the Bioeconomy Institute there, which is aiming to change how the economy works by changing like the feedstocks of carbon and energy from petrochemicals and petroleum to natural renewable sources, many of them from agricultural sources. She's also a relatively recent MacArthur Fellow, which she was awarded in part for working on the strips, the prairie strips project that we're going to be talking about a fair amount today. And so among many other honors that she has, that's one of hers. And so really excited to welcome her, and also excited to introduce in conversation with Dr. Moore, we have Professor Daniel Karp, Danny Karp from the Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology here at UC Davis. And he's he's like the perfect person to start this conversation because his research explores how we think about, measure, and manage biodiversity in human-dominated landscapes, like the agricultural ones we're talking about today. And he's done a lot of innovative work on how different components of those systems work together, like how it changes the system depending on what natural components are in there and how they're arranged, how that influences, say, birds, and how the birds influence the insects that are around, and then how that might influence then crop yield. So without further ado, I'd really like to welcome them both and turn the mic over to Professor Karp.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew. Thanks for inviting me to do this. I was very excited when this idea got floated past me. I've been a huge fan of Lisa's for well over a decade. She's always been sort of an agroecology hero of mine. So to put her on the spot and get to ask her lots of questions is kind of like a dream come true for me. So Lisa, great to have you here. I kind of wanted to just kick it off with a really broad question of, what got you interested in studying agricultural sustainability? Tell us a little bit about your path here to what you do now.
Well, thank you, Danny, and the respect is mutual. I love your work. And thank you, Andrew, for the very nice introduction and the invitation to be here today. In terms of the path, a circuitous winding path, I would say, to get to where I am today. It's always so interesting. Some people kind of know where they're going to go their whole lives and they end up there. I was exactly the opposite. First generation college student, biology major. I had no idea what I was going to do when I got to college. And so it's been quite a fun adventure. When I graduated from college, I was into forests, fire, and birds. And so that's what I did. I got to follow my interests and passions. And I did that in the Northern Great Lakes forests and spent about a decade working on forestry systems up there. Then I found myself a newly minted assistant professor at Iowa State University, and landing here in the middle of the country, Ames, Iowa, and got here and looked around. And I said, well, where's the forest? Right? And as a forest landscape ecologist, I didn't really want to study woodlots, right? Little postage stamps. And I didn't want to spend all my time traveling to get to research sites. I wanted to work where I was. And so I made a list my very first semester of the people on campus that I wanted to talk to and get to know, and had coffee or lunch with these people. And, was learning about the challenges of agriculture as Andrew introduced, right? We have to feed this growing human population without making a mess of the planet, right? We need a planet system that supports us as well. And I got hooked. I just was like, forestry, there's certainly challenges, there's roles for science, fire still, thinking about some of the invasive pests and diseases, climate change, obviously a huge issue. But I felt like I could potentially have more impact if I shifted my research program and started working on agriculture. And so that's what I did. This is a long time ago now for for the students in the group. It's 20 years ago. And so the one thing I would say for students is that time flies when you're having fun. It's been an amazing journey, and feels almost like a blink of an eye, 20 years. But it's been, yeah, totally amazing. And that's how I got to where I am today.
Great. So then, yeah, tell us a little bit about these prairie strips. This is kind of what you're best known for, I think, at this point, and what Andrew brought up a minute ago. Tell us, what they are, what kind of work you've done on them. Give us kind of an introduction to strips.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, to get us started, I'm going to read the USDA Conservation Reserve Program definition of prairie strips, and which says prairie strips are a practice that establishes diverse perennial vegetation oriented linearly through row crop fields. Prairie strips may not exceed 25% of the cropland area per tract, and range from between 30 and 120 feet in width. Machinery traffic is allowed on locations that replace turn rows on the perimeter of the field. Prairie strips reduce soil erosion, improve water quality, and provide wildlife habitat. So that is the definition that my team worked with USDA in 2019 to write. And the reason why we were asked to help write that definition is because in 2018, prairie strips were listed in the Farm Bill, the US Farm Bill, as a conservation reserve eligible practice. And my team's research helped get that to that point, right? To be listed in the US Farm Bill, federal legislation. But when I arrived at Iowa State University in 2003, there was no such thing as prairie strips, right? People may have been, restoring natural vegetation on farm fields, maybe even in linear configurations, but sort of prairie strips weren't a thing. And my very first semester here, as a part of those conversations I mentioned, some of those conversations led to the project that eventually became known as the STRIPS project. STRIPS stands for Science-Based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips. And the basic idea of, the interdisciplinary group of scientists that came together for that project is, our row crop systems are really challenged in terms of keeping their soil. They're challenged in terms of keeping their nutrients. There's challenges in terms of providing habitat for biodiversity. What's a solution that could help those three things? And we're really focused on those three things at that time. While at the same time recognizing that in order for farmers to do something new, we couldn't have huge impacts on their operations, how they farmed. And so this idea of prairie strips kind of came about through those conversations. And so in 2007, so now 15 years ago, we established an experiment to actually test that. A well-replicated catchment-based experiment where we integrated in prairie vegetation that we reestablished in either 10% of these catchments located either at the base of and when I say catchment, it's an area where rainfall, would fall on an area and run off.
Right.
So either at the base of that catchment at multiple points along the contour of a hill slope in that catchment, or at a 10% amount of that area or 20% amount of that area. And so then after we established the experiment, we took all sorts of measurements. And this is a large interdisciplinary team of soil scientists and hydrologists, and I was coming at it from plants and birds. We had agronomists on the team. We had entomologists, eventually sociologists and economists joined the team. So we were really looking at this a very integrated, interdisciplinary way. And after a few years of data collection, we found some pretty amazing things. And the big difference is just between if you have prairie or you don't have prairie in those catchments. So the configuration or the amount didn't matter too much. It's just getting that, that reconstructed prairie out there, intercepting, that runoff as it's running across the field and capturing it at the base. We found that we could keep 95% more of that soil in the field as opposed to running off the farm field. If we had 10% prairie strips, we could reduce nitrous oxide. We had looked at greenhouse gases too. We could reduce nitrous oxide from the foot slope of the catchment by 70%. We could retain 70% more nitrogen that was in the runoff, and then 70% more nitrogen that was moving with groundwater. That's my colleague Matt Helmers that did that work. From a bird biodiversity perspective, we could double the number of bird species using the prairie or the catchments and double the number of birds. And we could triple the number of pollinators, including improve the numbers of beneficial insects, other beneficial insects like insects that feed on crop pests, as you know so well. And so this 10% solution, all of a sudden is just like, wow, yes, farmers you would have to give up 10% of the area of their field, which is not insignificant. It's really significant, but yet we get all of these benefits if we're just really strategic about where we, put this reconstructed prairie vegetation in. So that's kind of was our pilot phase. One of the things that we did as a part of the project, and we did it as a part of a grant proposal because we wanted to get the grant, right? But we started hosting annual field days early on in the experiment, and it would invite people from commodity groups, from local NGOs, from state and federal government to come and see what we were doing science-wise. And that was a really important step because, early days, it didn't look like so much, but they were following the project over time and, they were like, wow, those numbers are amazing. And they started talking to their networks that included farmers. And then they started bringing farmers to the field days. And some of the farmers were looking at the data and looking at the arrangements and, they were saying, I think I want to try this. Like, I think what I'm seeing, it fits with my values for my farms. And, I think I want to try this. And so phase 2 was actually to work with farmers that came forward and said they wanted to try it. They wanted to try it on their fields. And they had quite an interesting time working with a bunch of interdisciplinary scientists, right? Trying to take something from an experimental approach to put it in their operations. And so I'm so thankful for their willingness to take a risk and also just willingness to, sit through the meetings and go through some pretty crazy designs until we, settled on something that worked for their fields. Really wonderful people. But then we were able to conduct research on their fields as well, and super fun, super interesting. They love getting data from their operations, right? And, we're seeing that the metrics aligned with what we saw in our initial experiment. And that combination of really great data, a broad consortium of stakeholders saying, this looks like this could work, right? And then the farmer willingness to put prairie strips on their fields, as well as share it with their neighbors, like, yeah, this is working for me, right? Like those three things together is what led to getting prairie strips in that 2018 Farm Bill.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. So there's, so many benefits that you just ran through really quickly with those really mind-boggling statistics. So when I think about integrating different agricultural practices, conservation practices into agricultural land, I often think about these trade-offs, right? So you mentioned one, which is this is land now that is no longer going to be cultivated. But if I'm a farmer, I'm thinking, okay, so there's this natural habitat coming in. Could it be a source of pests, of weeds? Could it be doing some bad things to my production? From a conservation perspective, putting on my conservation biologist hat, I could think am I just attracting all of these species into what we would call an ecological trap into the middle of this corn, soy desert, and they're sort of doomed to fail in the middle of these landscapes. So are there downsides? Can you speak to some of these, like what we would call ecosystem disservices, maybe out of these prairie strips? What do you think?
Yeah, great questions. And again, one of the things that I think was really important as a part of this process was, getting people out to see the research. And in addition to, doing show and tells, doing, listening sessions and really hearing from people what their concerns were. And as, farmers would come forward with concerns, we would be then able, we would try to address them right with our research. And so one of the first things that we heard is, why would anybody do that? We're just going to create a weed problem for farmers. It's like, well, we definitely don't want to do that, right? That would be really bad. And so my colleague, Matt Liebman, he had a student, Sarah Hirsch, who's now faculty member out in Maryland. They looked at that. They looked at sort of weed dynamics in crop fields and found that yes, in our fields with prairie strips, there were weeds, but they're the annual weeds that farmers fight everywhere, right? They're not the weeds that they're not native plants, right? And what we're seeing is that in general, the native plants that we're seeking to establish, they stay pretty well put. They don't really hold up to crop management, right? The traffic, the management traffic, the spraying, the fertilization, the native plants that we want to establish are pretty much staying put. Yeah, weeds are a problem everywhere, but the weeds that we were seeing weren't, associated with a prairie strip. That said, one of the things that we've learned in establishment is there's one perennial weed in the prairie strips that we have to be very careful to help manage during establishment, Canada thistle. And we're trying to innovate and figure out new ways to deal with that particular weed. It's not that it affects the crop fields, it's just, it gets around the agricultural landscape and grass waterways and field borders. We want to try to manage that. So weeds were a concern with farmers, and we were able to address it through research. Also, some farmers, they innovate. One of the things that being out on a field with a farmer that he said is that he tries to plant his crop like right on the border with prairie strips. And the reason, and he's not expecting to get any yield, from that particular row, but he doesn't want to leave any open soil or open patch for sunlight, right, where weeds can establish. So he kind of looks at that as kind of a sacrifice row, but it's a part of his management, right? So the weed issue, we've had farmers very interested in whether they understand that, establishing that native community, that there's benefits to soil health, and we've shown through research really strong benefits to soil health. Farmers have asked, do those soil health benefits translate out into the field adjacent to the prairie strip? Say, for example, just higher nutrient availability. They're very interested in whether this is getting into the weeds, but whether the microbial community changes as a result of prairie strips and how far that extends into the field. And so we've done research around that, and we have found that there is soil effects that extend into the field. This is my colleagues, Marshall McDaniel and Cole Dutter, but that it doesn't really extend very far enough to matter, right? So those are some of the sort of a couple key things. And then you asked about sort of the, bringing biodiversity out into the crop environment, right? Which can be a hostile environment. And does that have a negative effect on them? What we found, first of all, from a bird standpoint, a couple of students that finished up with me in the last year, now Dr. Matt Stevenson and Dr. Jordan Gies, what we found is that that prairie strips, in terms of the habitat quality, is much higher than other types of conservation practices that are going to be available in this landscape. So other things that farmers might do to, for example, contain soil erosion or, protect an area along a stream, they might do a terrace or a monocultural brome, cool season grass buffer. Prairie strips are much better in terms of higher densities of birds and higher levels of nest success than those areas. This is a massive effort. We collected data on thousands of bird nests, so to get sort of an estimate of nest success. And what we found is that the rate of reproduction is similar to larger patches of reconstructed prairie in this particular landscape. We couldn't tell a difference between reconstructed prairie and prairie strips in terms of the rate of nest success of grassland birds through this research. Now, that said, not all grassland birds are going to nest in prairie strips, right? So it's things like red-winged blackbirds and dickcissels and common yellowthroats and field sparrows. It's not, some of those really area sensitive birds, nor did we expect it to be. So things like bobolinks, Henslow sparrows, they're not going to nest in prairie strips. So it's only a subset of the, bird species that will nest there, but it seems to be providing adequate habitat for those birds. In terms of the pollinators, getting to the insects, right? What we found is that looking at wild bees as well as honeybees, the health of those bees is better on fields with prairie strips. And this is work Kate Borchert is just finishing her PhD this year, has looked at wild bees and multiple measures of bee health, and just published a paper late last year, I think in Biological Conservation, showing that the health of wild bees is better, and the plant bee interactions are much more diverse on fields with prairie strips than fields without. And similarly, we looked at honeybees. This is an agricultural working landscape, right? So that reason, but also because honeybees are much easier to actually study than wild bees. And so this is work Amy Toth, Matt O'Neill, Guzang. What we're seeing is that honeybees that on fields with prairie strips are much healthier. They have a much more diverse diet. So just like us, honeybees do better with a more diverse diet, as opposed to just if they're eating soybean nectar and pollen. And that translates into both more honey production as well as better overwinter survival for those honeybees. And so, all this evidence is coming in, right? Again, we're taking land out of production that's meaningful for farmers, but all of this evidence is coming in suggesting that prairie strips is a win-win-win-win, which is super exciting. But, because of that loss of production, that's what makes getting prairie strips in the CRP program so very important. So farmers can be compensated for, you losing that corn and soybean yield, but then also for providing all of these environmental benefits that we all enjoy societally.
Cool. Okay, so we've got all these benefits then we've been talking about, right? We've got these, soil erosion, nutrient retention type of benefits, greenhouse gas kind of benefits, biodiversity, pollination, maybe not so many weed problems that you'd need to be concerned about. You do have the area taken out of production, but then you've done all this work trying to create incentive programs through the Farm Bill, through our NRCS, so that they can apply and get some money for this. So given all of that, and now you're a long way into this project, are farmers sort of adopting this practice? How common is the practice now within Iowa? Do you see uptake in other states? Why would then some farmers choose to adopt it, some wouldn't? What are you thinking there?
Yeah. Well, thankfully, farmers are adopting it. And what we hear from farmers that are adopting is that that the benefits matches their values for their farms. Like that is the main thing, is that they want to be good stewards of the land, and as well as provide other marketable goods, right, as farmers. In terms of the uptake, at the time that prairie strips was put in the 2008-15 Farm Bill, we had worked with about both us as well as cooperating NGOs like Sand County Foundation, and government organizations like Minnesota, their Board of Soil and Water Resources. There were about 60 farms with prairie strips that we knew about in 2018. And many of them we had helped design, the strips team had helped design their prairie strips implementation. Today, they're just with the Conservation Reserve Program statistics, there's over 22,000 acres of prairie strips in 14 different states. So really broad willingness among farmers to put prairie strips on their land. And one of the things that we hear from folks in USDA about that program and why farmers are adopting it is because it's very flexible. It's one of the most flexible conservation practices under the Conservation Reserve Program. And why is that? Well, because as we were writing that policy, we were in dialogue with, some of our farmer partners, and they said, well, if you want people to do this, you have to make it spatially flexible in terms of the amount of land and the placement of land in prairie strips. And so, they spoke, we listened, it was written into the policy, and now they're accepting it, right? So I think sort of, a main takeaway I would have for students or anyone on here that's listening is, being in really close dialogue with the stakeholder community that you're seeking to serve. The benefits are many. One of the benefits is I've just learned so much, right, from talking with farmers, but then getting the policy right, super important that way as well. The other thing I would say is, so we had been doing human dimensions research, as I mentioned, alongside some of the biophysical work on prairie strips. And so we knew that prairie strips, in terms of a conservation practice, it's one of the most effective and cost-effective conservation practices available to farmers. If they know they have a resource problem on their farm in terms of soil erosion, that's one of the main, drivers is soil erosion. They want to fix that soil erosion problem. Or maybe, they've already had an eroded hillside and they want to improve that soil quality. Sometimes it's water quality as a big driver. But we knew that, it's cost effective if farmers are looking to adopt conservation. We also knew that, this is work by J.R. Buckle, an extension sociologist here at Iowa State. We also knew that if, the farmer could get a CRP payment, that it increased their willingness to consider prairie strips by 45%. So having, some way to, help with a monetary compensation really improved adoption rate. We knew by 2020 about, well over half of farmers said that they had heard of prairie strips, they wanted to know more, and were considering prairie strips. These are Iowa farmers considering prairie strips on their land, and 25% of farmers said that, yes, they would be very interested in prairie strips on their land. So just, we knew very broadly that there was an openness to it. That said, farmers are not monolithic, and we have research around that as well. We did a typology study here in Iowa. J.R. Buckle and Suraj Upadhyaya, a postdoc that's now a faculty member at Kentucky State. And we know that there's 4 kinds of farmers when it comes to conservation. And one of those types, they identify themselves very strongly as conservationist farmers. Those are the most willing to put prairie strips on their land. And that's where we're probably getting, the majority of the adoption is from these conservationist farmers. These are people that have basically every single, practice in a corn and soybean system that you could put on your land, on their land. So they'll be doing no-till, they'll be doing cover crops, they'll have saturated buffers or bioreactors, they'll be doing nutrient and soil testing very regularly, right? They want all the things because, that conservationist part is such a strong part of their identity. And then we know with the 3 other types, 2 of the 3 other types, that we have some penetration, and then there's a 4th type that we call legacy farmers in the paper, and with very little willingness to adopt prairie strips. And so there's different types of farmers out there. It's not going to be the solution for everyone, and that's okay. We've got another tool in the toolbox for the farmers that are willing to consider it.
Cool. So then broadening up a bit now, thinking kind of about prairie strips in the context of broader sort of agricultural sustainability. How far do you think prairie strips will sort of get us towards realizing the agricultural sustainability needs in the corn soy landscapes of the Midwest? In short, like, do you think we need to fundamentally transform the way that we are doing agriculture to be sustainable now and looking forward? Or do you think we can sort of like move the needle in the right direction by approaches like prairie strips, maybe combined with other things? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, that's $1 million question, or a billion, or trillion, maybe even, right? So, I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't. But I guess two things related to that. There's a lot of demand for diversifying agriculture these days. California, here in the Midwest, Northeast. And I just did a series of workshops with people in Iowa asking about, the opportunities in regenerative agriculture. And so there was lots of people commenting on, we need more fruit and vegetable production, right? We need to diversify. We need more small grain systems. We need to diversify our agriculture. And that's great. We definitely do. But we also need markets to support that, right? And so there was a study done in 2011 here in Iowa looking at that opportunity to diversify in fruit and vegetable production. And that study found that, if based on municipal demand here in Iowa, that we would be able to grow all the fruits and vegetables to meet local consumption needs on about 10,500 acres. Now there's 30 million acres of agricultural land in Iowa, right? So 10,500 versus 30 million. Right. So I'm all for, diversifying with, these systems, but we need more demand. And unfortunately, good for you, but bad for us. We have a really hard time competing in other markets, for our fruit and vegetable production, because you are so much more efficient at it than we are, right? You have a longer growing season, first of all, that helps a lot, right? And you have the labor, whereas we don't. So we just can't compete in that area. So I oftentimes look at, okay, given some of these systems dynamics, how do we improve the system that we have right now? And so that's really my focus, and I applaud folks that are working on some of these developing these other markets around, say, perennial grains for human food consumption, and creating more demand for fruits and vegetables. But I'm really centered on how do we take the systems we have right now and really improve it. And there are many, many exciting things that are happening. The precision agriculture movement has been around for, over 2-3 decades now. And it's exciting that it's at the point where, farmers don't have to look at maps anymore. It's just in the combine, right? They can make some of these precision ag. It can be programmed in, like, for example, variable nutrient application or herbicide application can be, programmed in. And so it's easier for farmers to actually implement things like that. Exciting things. We're worried about drought here too. California is not the only place worried about drought. And so looking at controlled drainage, for example, which could really help in terms of both nutrient retention as well as reducing greenhouse gases. There are exciting things around there. Cover crops, right? That's what got me into this whole thing to begin with, is just seeking ways that we can keep the ground covered 365 days of the year. Cover crops is something that's really moving forward. And then, prairie strips as a perennial system. a couple of my projects, what we're trying to do now is, create more demand for keeping that land covered by actually harvesting winter crops that have been established on fields. So creating a market for that biomass, as well as creating a market based on the biomass of the prairie. And again, getting back to the, farmers aren't monolithic. There's different types, right? For some, if we can make prairie a crop, harvest that biomass, it will better link to their identity as farmers, right? And will help them justify
Right.
sort of, establishing prairie on additional acres on their land. So I kind of did a little bit of a circle, but I think I mostly answered your question.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So then, yeah, along those same lines, you described a bunch of different practices. If you were to like fast forward 25 years from now, it's 2050. What's your like ideal vision of what Midwest corn soy agriculture looks like? Let's say everything goes right according to you, and you have a sustainable agro ecosystem. What does that look like?
Yeah. And fantastic question. And I'll provide you with an answer. But one of the things I want to emphasize is it's not just my answer. I do a lot of human dimensions research alongside the biophysical. And so, as a part of focus groups and interviews, workshops, this is a vision that is much bigger than me, right? This is coming from stakeholders that I've interacted with for 20 years here in Iowa. And in 2050, sort of the vision is there'll actually be a lot more people here in Iowa. So we only have 3.2 million people, right, on about 32 or 3.2 million people on about 32 million acres of land. So we have room for a lot more people. And if we had more people here, it would really help us diversify our agriculture. So that's a vision. So if California fires drive people out, if East Coast hurricanes, if they drive people out, we have land here in Iowa. If you can withstand the winter, right? There's opportunity here for you. So yeah, 2050, there would be a lot more people driving more demand for more diversification of our agriculture. The other thing is that, people recognize that, our most fundamental asset here in the Midwest it's our soil. Yes, climate is super important to, the fact that, we have a decent growing season, not quite like yours, but, the soil is the foundation of our wealth here, and widespread agreement, we need to do a better job of not only protecting, but rejuvenating our soil. And so this, idea of, keeping the ground covered resonates. And my goal is by 2050 that there is no bare ground in Iowa when you drive around in the winter. And creating the markets, creating the cultural awareness, creating frankly, it's going to be policy, creating the policy that helps allow that. That's what we need to get people working together on, because it's a shared value. It's a shared goal. Right now our soil on most acres is bare about 7 months a year. That is not sustainable, right? So yeah, by 2050, there's no bare acres in the Corn Belt anymore. That's my vision. And
Cool.
broadly
Okay.
shared, like I said.
So vision into the future, it's a much more diversified agricultural system, a lot more things grown. We've got this sort of perennial cover all over the ground. I assume there's also lots of prairie strips all over the place as well in that vision into the future as well. Yeah, I could make that assumption. So then what's sort of stopping us from realizing that vision? Are there any sort of policies, incentives, other approaches that we could use to maybe remove some of the barriers you see that might be preventing farmers, others from kind of creating that change we might want to see?
Yeah. Well, I'm optimistic about the future. just, the amount of change that I've seen in my time here, right? And when I first got here, started talking about prairie strips, like literally people said, that's a crazy idea. Why would you ever do that? Right. To now it being a part of federal policy, and at least, farmers that own and manage 22,000 acres across 14 states thought it was a decent idea. Right. So I've seen, so much change in my 20 years here. As I fast forward, I think, part of the beauty of prairie strips is all those environmental outcomes, right? But I think probably the more important part of it is helping farmers who typically manage, corn and soybeans. So as monocultures, right? They're non-native monocultures, they're annuals, right? Helping them understand how to manage and the diverse values provided by native perennial polycultures, right? So we're asking them kind of to do something that's the opposite of what they're used to doing. And so they have to learn how to do that. And prairie strips helps them learn how to manage a native perennial polyculture, right? And it's so cool to hear farmers talk about, well, when they put the prairie strips on, they have these very pragmatic reasons, like, soil, I want to stop this soil erosion problem. Like it fits into this, my operation. That field was a little, oddly shaped anyway, where we evened it out, right? There's really pragmatic reasons. But then once they have the prairie strips in place, it's so cool to hear them talk about how, well, that's the place where my, granddaughter had her senior pictures taken, or, I carry these scissors in my glove box of my truck. So I can, when I go by the prairie strips, I can stop and cut some flowers and bring them home to my wife. Or, I love the prairie strips because it sounds like my grandfather's farm, because there's life out there again. Right. So all of a sudden you hear this shift from these very pragmatic reasons to these nostalgic and emotional reasons for why prairie strips. And I think that is probably having, well, one, teaching people about the value of perennial, native polycultures, and then having them experience these profound, shifts in their mindset. That is probably the biggest value of prairie strips. And so I'm super excited for the future, because if farmers connect with them and love them and tell their neighbors about them, that's really what's going to foster really dramatic change.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love hearing that. I mean, in so much of the environmental movement, when you think about, the ecosystem benefits we get from nature ecosystem services, it ends up being that there are these, like, the cultural sort of non-tangible spiritual connections to nature that end up trumping the biophysical things every time. And when you kind of reestablish contact between people and nature in the way that you're doing, and you start to see, like, hey, it's providing these cultural values and that environmental awareness, then maybe it is sort of like a bridge into that future that you're wanting to realize, as well as providing all those other kinds of ancillary benefits to people. That's
Awesome.
really great.
So well said. Thank you for putting
Yeah,
that.
well, yeah. No, I think this is a good point. I've asked a lot of questions. I think it'd be nice at this point to kind of switch over to the audience and start asking questions from the audience. And I see some questions chatted at me from the host, so thank you guys. So let's start off with, first, neither corn nor soybean require pollinators. So, why should you care about all these pollinators going into the fields and prairie strips?
Yeah. Well, let's see, a couple things. One, we did some survey research, and even though soybeans don't require pollination, people generally understand that pollinators are needed in agricultural systems, right? So when we asked Iowans about their highest priority for conservation practices, the very first one was was water quality, and the very next one was pollinators. And that was true of the non-farming as well as the farming public. So, the even though it's not needed, it's high. There's research from, did a paper with Lucas Garibaldi a couple years ago, Argentinian scientists looking at the potential to improve soybean yield with pollination. And there is evidence globally that even though soybean doesn't need to be pollinated, it will yield better with pollination. Now, there's some questions around, well, is that really more in global or in tropical areas versus temperate
Right.
areas? That some things that need to be worked out. How much habitat do you need to actually, support the pollinators, and where does it need to be to experience that? There's some research that still needs to be done around that. But, farmers are actually quite smitten with this, at least some set of farmers are quite smitten with this idea that they might be able to boost their pollination of their soybean yield with pollinators. So I think that's an open question that needs to be looked at as well.
Yeah, and I think kind of getting back to what we were just talking about as well, pollinators are often these charismatic, either bees or butterflies, hummingbirds, kind of creatures that resonate with people a lot. So some of those cultural benefits directly by them, as well as people are realizing that some of those flowers that they want to cut and bring back to their spouses, right, need pollinators around as well. So recognizing those ecosystem kind of consequences, I think, is important as well. Next question. Do you see prairie strips becoming a major sort of CRP practice, the CRP practice?
Well, let's see. Every farm is different. Okay, I gotta say that, right? And farmers are gonna do what makes sense for their operations. That said, one of the things that I was just as coming at this as an ecologist, right? One of the things that I was just so proud of when prairie strips got in the Farm Bill is that it is really the only practice that really emphasizes a native vegetation, right? The other ones will allow it, but prairie strips was the first one to really emphasize native vegetation. And when you think about trying to achieve as many, ecosystem services on as small an area as possible, right? Being really cost effective and achieving the conservation outcomes, it just makes sense to use native species, right? They're going to be well adapted to the climate, the soil of the region. The native species are going to be well adapted to those native species. So it just, it just makes sense. And so yeah, I do hope that prairie strips
Yeah,
becomes the
totally.
premier CRP practice.
Cool. The next question I'm going to pose to you, but I'm anticipating you might just turn it around and throw it at me. Um, how does sustainable agriculture look like in the Yolo County area where we are in Davis? And are local farmers adopting healthy practices like prairie strip? So maybe you've got some sort of insight into what's going on in California related to prairie strips that you want to share, or then I can hop in and I'll talk a little bit afterwards.
As much as I love California, I am so busy in Iowa.
Okay. Cool,
This
I'll
one's
take
yours,
it.
Amy.
Yeah, so I'll handle this one. Yeah, so in Yolo County, we have our own series of things that are implemented on farms. There's been a lot of work looking at more traditional, like perennial hedgerow type of work along field edges, and a lot of great work out of UC Davis, out of UC Berkeley, showing that you can kind of put these hedgerows along field edges and boost pollinators, as well as pest control in some cases, really effectively, and doing so without some of these major disservices that we might be worried about, including bringing foodborne diseases onto farm fields. So the analogy I think about prairie strips out here would probably be hedgerows, though they're smaller scale, but the perennial part is shared. Flower strips may be similar and is something that's adopted out here as well. And then the other major thing out here that we think a lot about is rice production in Yolo County, right? And so we have this practice where rice farmers will flood their fields in winter, and that ends up becoming surrogate wetland for the millions of migratory waterfowl that are coming down along the Pacific Flyway. And if we didn't have rice in many senses throughout the Central Valley, we might actually see like the complete collapse of the Pacific Flyway of these waterbirds. So it's kind of one of the only other really kind of large scale production practices in industrial agriculture that I know about, that you're really like sort of sharing the landscape with wildlife that's really effective. So maybe that gets sort of at some of these questions about Yolo County specific stuff. Moving on. Next question, incredibly exciting work off the cuff. Do you see roles for sort of psychological researchers to engage in these research efforts? And I bet you do, given some of the kind of human dimension stuff you've been referencing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yes. I'm really curious about some of the, social psychology around change. I think that there's awesome opportunity to do some work there. Yeah, so yes, please.
Cool. Another question, I just saw it came in right now. Do you see any potential for harvesting native plants in prairie strips, like herbal wild crafting, perhaps? There's some effort exploring harvestable crops and hedgerows here in California, like elderberry.
I
I
love
didn't
this
know
idea.
that, so that's cool. Thank you for sharing that, Sonia.
Yeah. I love this idea and would love to be able to explore it more. I just have sort of one story around that. One of the farm landowners that we work with in Northwest Iowa has prairie strips on his land. It's near a town, more of it's called Spirit Lake, Okoboji region. It's more of a recreational region here. And the town of Spirit Lake has a local apothecary, a natural apothecary. And so the landowner told the owner of the apothecary that, she can come out to his prairie strips and harvest, medicinal plants anytime, right? So, we don't have research around that, but I think that's a
Oh,
really fun story to share that, people are already starting to do that, right? In this case, and there's probably others as well. That's just the one I know.
cool. Another question coming in. Thanks for sending them as we're kind of going here to keep them going. Are the big corporate farms getting on board with prairie strips, or is this more of a small farmer practice? They're also asking who's funding your research as a kind of follow-up. But first, can you answer that about like, is it large farms? Is it small farms?
Yeah, really farms of all sizes. I think we've worked with farmers that, may just have 30 acres and literally like 1 acre of prairie strips. And then farmers that are farming, 2,000 acres and, they have an erosion problem on one field or something, or an area
Hmm.
that's just lower profit, hard to farm where, they're looking at prairie strips as an option. So that's about the size range. I don't think that we're working with anybody yet that's, at least that I know of, that's bigger than about 2,000 acre corn and soybean farmer. Well, but then again, we're also working with Smithfield Foods in northern Missouri. And now that I think about it, I think they own about 10,000, or no, they own about 25,000 acres in northern
Wow.
Missouri. And they've converted about 1,000 acres into large patches of prairie, and they've put prairie strips on. They've got about 160 acres of prairie strips on some of their other fields. So I guess, yes, we are working with small and large and everything in between. So yeah. And I do see opportunities to interact with some of those larger farmers here in Iowa. As I mentioned, we did this typology study. One of the other types, so there's a conservationist farmer, the legacy farmer, farmer type we call deliberative. And the really main thing that stood out with that group is that they're willing to make conservation decisions, but it's going to take them a long time, and they're going to do a lot of research and talk to a lot of people before they get there. And then the fourth group is the productivist farmer. And they are sort of what oftentimes comes to mind to people's mind when you think about corn and soybean production. They're very, very business minded, and they tend to own and operate the largest land holdings. And they are willing to consider prairie strips, but it's got to be, you got to connect with the economic decision. So when you look at sort of low profitability corn and soybean land that maybe providing a drag on their income because it's just not well suited for corn and soybeans, those are the acres that we're looking for them. It's not going to be, every field everywhere, but, where are those acres that maybe don't make sense economically to farm corn and soybeans? So yeah, we can reach different groups of farmers in different ways. In terms of funding, initial funding for prairie strips research came from U.S. Forest Service, National Science Foundation, Iowa State University. We then got some grants from USDA, NIFA, National Institute for Food and Agriculture. We then were funded for the farmer outreach piece by the McKnight Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation continued USDA funding. More recently, we've got funding from a California organization to expand regionally. The Bioeconomy Foundation has provided funding. And we did have matching funds. We had a FAR grant to look at the pollinator piece, and we had matching funds from Bayer and Syngenta for that FAR grant, FAR's Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. Now have big grants from both USDA, NIFA, as well as USDA overall funding the work.
I love the fact that prairie strips are scalable from those really small to the very large farms, and the typology you're thinking about. We did something similar looking at California production in the Central Coast, sort of like salad bowl of the United States. And in our case, thinking about diversification practices more generally, it was really interesting. A lot of the typology ends up being about farm size, and much more about barriers than farmer identity, where the really small farmers are facing so many costs and so many constraints that it's hard for them to implement a lot of the diversification practices. Go to the other side and you see the really large scale production corporate farmers. Those guys have a different sort of constraint that they face about, like, the food needs to be delivered at a certain time of year, and it has to have a certain quality control, and there's food safety considerations, and all of that really ends up causing conflicts with diversification practices and serves as a barrier. And then the sweet spot are the kind of middle farmers, the middle sizes, where you see the greatest adoption of the diversification practices. Sadly, though, the middle-sized farmers are the ones that are being lost the most as you sort of consolidate and create large or really small. So yeah, it's interesting how that typology plays out with different practices in different places. I'm not seeing any more questions right now in the chat. Andrew, I don't know if there's any other ones you want to go for from here.
Hey, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah, well, I was just curious. Maybe I missed this, but I know that one of the things that Lisa you've worked on is like biodigestion, and I wondered if that comes together at all with the perennial crop culture in the strips. Is there a lot? Does that and if you're harvesting some of that, does that change the effect of them?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, so I am working on biodigestion. Never in a million years when I started on my career would I ever think I was be working on biodigestion, but here I am. For a really long time, people have been looking at, how do we create energy from, perennial grasses? It's been a focus of US DOE, Department of Energy, for a really long time. We had a cellulosic ethanol attempt here in the Midwest, right, to try to diversify the feedstocks that are being used for fuel production in this area. And why? Well, one, trying to get away from fossil energy sources, and especially fossil energy sources from areas of the planet that are hostile to the US, right? That was the big motivator. But here, again, as I alluded to at one point, we need markets, right? And we just don't have enough people. We've already figured out how to feed the world 1.5 times over, right? Not that there aren't problems with distribution, but energy is a really big market, much bigger than a food market. And so when we look at trying to incentivize diverse practices or different practices, we look at energy markets. So you know, people have basically said that, you know, cellulosic ethanol from native grasses is probably not going to work at scale. I mean, I mean, we tried it, right? And it went bust. And, you know, a big problem with that is the transportation costs associated with the feedstocks. And with the cellulosic ethanol, I'm getting into the weeds, sorry, but it has to be large scale biorefineries. And so feedstock transportation, feedstock supply ends up being a really big cost constraint. Anaerobic digesters work economically at a smaller scale than sort of large scale biorefineries for ethanol. And so that's what got me to anaerobic digestion, is it works at a smaller scale. So you can get the sort of energy converter, right, that bioreactor closer to the feedstock supply, and you can overcome some of those transportation costs. So yeah, I've along with Raceline Alternative Energy and 13 other partners, we've got one of the USDA Climate Smart grants to look at, you know, can we establish prairie as a bioenergy feedstock? Can we, as well as winter crops as a bioenergy feedstock, convert it to renewable natural gas by anaerobic digestion and cleaning the biogas for renewable natural gas, and then also creating other co-products from that process. So yes, I'm working on biodigestion, and that's why. But again, it's trying to, you know, create that market incentive. You know, CRP is great, but I also have worked with plenty of farmers that said that they're never ever going to sign a contract with the federal government. And so creating market-based mechanisms to achieve the conservation goals is kind of where we're going with this.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the harvest effect, well, ask me in another 3 or 4 years, because we're just getting that research out on the ground right now.
Cool. All right, I'll stay tuned.
Great. Awesome.
Cool. Well, I don't think I see any more questions at this point, so maybe we should wrap it up. And thank you so much, Lisa, for coming and answering all of my questions and the audience questions. It was so great to learn more and hear about all the things you're up to.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Danny, Andrew, Elena. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to the group here with you at UC Davis and the Institute of the Environment. Thank you so much for tuning in and for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. Been fun.
Sure thing. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.